Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the future of government spending after the coronavirus. And can we spend our way out of this crisis? In the wake of the corona crisis, governments around the world have been spending trillions to keep the economy afloat, with much of the money being created out of thin air by the central banks. How is it that we can just keep printing money with no inflation? Where does this money come from, and how does so-called modern monetary theory fit into all this? What does this mean for the future of government spending, and why can't developing countries do this? All that in this video. To answer these questions, I'll once again be having a discussion with my American colleague, Arjit, who has worked on multiple political campaigns in the state of Virginia and is studying philosophy, politics, and economics. You can find the link to our last discussion right up here. Welcome back.
Hello everybody.
So during the pandemic, we've seen massive levels of government spending financed by central banks who are expanding the money supply. But even though all this money is being printed, just like in 2009, there doesn't seem to be massive inflation, and most economists believe that the government can and should spend even more to combat the coronavirus recession. But the so-called deficit hawks who are concerned about the debt and the deficit are getting in the way. Now, you've studied some economics at George Mason University, which is famous for its focus on libertarian free market economics, unsurprisingly funded by the Koch brothers. What do you think about the current levels of government spending? Should it be more or less?
I think that the one thing most people don't like to admit is that when it comes to macroeconomics, there's still a lot of things we just don't understand. The models used by central bankers and policy advisors themselves are outdated and inaccurate, and COVID-19 is only proving that further. On one hand, there are people seeing this as proof that our previous hawkishness was just not justified, and that a progressive spending agenda has always been possible. And there's another who believe that the negative effects are severe, but not immediately obvious. We can go through the valid concerns people have on these new models of government spending, but first, what's your take?
Well, the way I see it, it's clear that many governments are failing in their coronavirus response due to outdated economic models. In the United States, and to a lesser extent in the European Union, the response has been lackluster. You're seeing record unemployment in Spain, collapsing GDP in Italy, and in America you have 30 to 40 million people who could be evicted from their homes. This is completely avoidable human suffering. Policymakers have shown no restraints when it comes to funding foreign wars and bank bailouts, but during this pandemic they've been unnecessarily stingy with government aid because of fears of inflation that simply haven't come true. In fact, just recently, here in the Netherlands, the government shot down a proposal to increase the salaries of healthcare workers who have gotten us through this pandemic. I think it's clear that governments should be doing more, not less.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Governments should be spending more right now. But I can tell you why there are concerns about what central banks are doing. To start with, remember, what happens isn't really money printing. The central bank controls the money supply by setting interest rates, adjusting reserve requirements, and buying government debt. Since 2009, central banks like the United States Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank have also engaged in quantitative easing, where they purchase safe assets from the private sector with newly created cash. This is meant to stimulate new lending.
So what happens isn't really an airdrop of cash, but rather the money slowly trickles down through the financial system, so some people get the money before others.
Yes, and it creates unfair winners and losers. Those who benefit the most from it are those who can capture the new money first, but benefit off of lower prices, which depends entirely on the structure of how money is infused into the economy. This is known as the Cantelon Effect. In our system, the big winners are financiers. It's important to know that this sort of trickle-down inflation changes the relative price structure without changing the real fundamentals in the economy.
So the fear is that even if creating all this money doesn't cause a massive inflation, it does distort prices in such a way that causes people to invest too much in some things and too little in others, which could create the same investment bubbles that we saw in 2009.
Exactly. There are fears that how we've been combating downturns with loose monetary policy and increased government spending creates systemic problems in the economy, influencing the business cycle and creating new crises, which means more bailouts and more spending, which has in sum exploded national debt around the world. In the UK, the national debt has exploded to £2 trillion for the first time, or 100% of the national GDP. We need a whole new way to think about government spending.
Well, there is an alternative. It's called MMT, or modern monetary theory. According to MMT, monetary policy shouldn't be the main way to combat downturns because it's ineffective. Rather, fiscal policy or government spending should be our primary tool. According to MMT economists, in countries that are sovereign currency issuers, government deficits and public debt isn't a problem at all, and central banks can give governments zero-interest money to finance new spending all the time. Let me explain it simply. In countries like the United States, Japan, and the Eurozone, public debt is denominated in a currency that the government itself issues, which means these governments will never be in a situation like Argentina where they have to default on their debt. They can always create more money to pay back their debts to creditors. And when the debt is owned by the country's own central bank, the money isn't really owed to anyone at all. It's simply an accounting trick where the central bank credits the government with spending power. It's just numbers on a computer. The only constraint on government spending is high inflation. At some point, too much money is chasing too few goods. According to MMT, this hasn't happened recently because there's a lot of untapped productive potential, or slack, in the economy. Basically, until we see all those productive resources employed, the government should keep spending. And when we see high inflation, we can simply lower spending or just increase taxes to take some of that money out of circulation. The government's job is to manage the money supply and achieve full employment. And so the public debt isn't a problem or an obstacle to helping people in need. It's just an accounting identity. Now, it's important to note that not every country can do this. You need to have what is called a simultaneous fiscal deficit and current account surplus. Now, that sounds complicated, but what that means is that governments can run deficits. They can spend more money than they bring in, as long as the public, so households and businesses, have a surplus, so they're saving money on average, because in this situation, the national economy as a whole still has a surplus. To put it simply, in a country like India, inflation is already very high. If the government is running a deficit, but the public is also spending more than it takes in, then the economy as a whole is in a deficit and the currency loses its value. Add to that the fact that developing countries often lack the strong institutions necessary to stop the government from printing more and more money, even when inflation is already rising. And so this means that only a handful of countries around the world can actually do what modern monetary theory proposes. So to deal with and prevent economic recessions like the corona crisis, developed countries could have policies like a Green New Deal, which is currently being proposed by the EU. Policies like these can serve as an economic stimulus.
I think Kelton is very right in an important sense. The real limits of government spending isn't revenue, it's real resources. The former Federal Reserve Chairman said so himself. The question that does arise in developed countries is, do we have the material resources to give everyone a decent standard of living, healthcare, and a home? It's clear that the answer is yes, in terms of real resources. We just don't have an economic system that allocates those resources to make that a reality. And economists like Kelton think that governments fully embracing their sovereign currency power may be the mechanism to make those sort of investments. Where we've previously thought about redistribution in the form of taxation and spending, MMT proponents are really talking about redistributing purchasing power. That's a dangerous game. We can put it really simply. One of the most important functions of money is that it is a store of value and a unit of account. That's why we use it and rely on it. MMT proposals directly attack that conception of money. Money is now simply a way to procure resources with the backings of state power. They believe that money draws its value from the fact that the government demands it in taxes. That is to say, I will always choose to hold US dollars, not necessarily because it's the most reliable medium of exchange, but because I'll always need to pay back Uncle Sam or go to prison. This is among the reasons they believe that sovereign currency issuers have a lot of freedom to mess with money's main functions. We don't have alternatives. On every dollar bill, there is a demand. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. In the old days, they used to say, redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury. A promise has been replaced by a demand, and MMT economists know this. Since Bretton Woods, money has had value through reliability in exchange and state sanction. The last of these will be their foundation to undermine the first.
Yes, but in any case, it's clear that some major spending program is needed. Around the world, we've been unable to tax the wealthy because of tax loopholes and tax havens. Right here in the Netherlands, we have over 14,000 so-called mailbox companies. These are companies that operate in other countries but have a physical address in the form of a mailbox in the Netherlands so they can avoid taxes in other countries. And these kinds of policies have very real effects on income inequality. Analysis by the nonpartisan Rand Corporation shows that over the last 20 years in America, over $50 trillion has been redistributed from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. That's $2.5 trillion every single year. And this redistribution can be attributed to policies like tax cuts, tax loopholes, wage suppression, and deregulation. To put this into perspective, that means that the median American worker would be earning double of what they are today if these policies had not been put in place and we had the same income distribution as in 1975. It's clear that something needs to be done. We already see some steps toward this with the EU's new anti-tax avoidance proposal.
I agree we need to tax the rich more, but it's important to note that even taxing the rich won't be enough to finance the kind of spending we need. I think what we need in the United States is something like the VAT, or value-added tax, to finance more generous social programs. My fear is that this central bank finance deficit spending will become a political shortcut, as politicians are scared to increase taxes in the middle class and don't abandon the tax the rich siren song. It's a myth that in America, at least, we could have a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and universal childcare if we only raise taxes on the top 0.1%, but not the middle class. Again, I agree we should tax the wealthy more. We're unfortunately entering a situation where governments are realizing they can spend without making the hard reforms, and we don't necessarily know where it will lead us. Keynesian tools were meant to battle recessions and emergencies, but if you look at the past 2 decades, low interest rates, monetary expansion, and high deficits haven't been limited to downturns, they've become permanent features. The government having the ability to spend and procure resources without the consent of the governed is fundamentally antithetical to the liberal tradition. Our votes on spending don't mean anything if the government can just do what it wants by controlling the central bank and manipulating the money supply. We've severed an important link between the government and the governed.
Well, first of all, a value-added tax is regressive. It hurts the poor the most. On the other hand, unshackled from financing constraints, governments can finally adopt the kind of spending we need to combat our most pertinent issues. A Green New Deal for Europe to fight climate change, UBI to provide a guaranteed minimum standard of living, and in the United States, a Medicare for all universal healthcare system. The question isn't the cost of government action, but the tremendous costs of inaction. If we continue down the path we're on, we'll only see inequality worsen, public trust in government erode, and the damage caused by climate change accelerate. If governments are learning they have the tools to make these necessary investments in their people and our future, we may be better off in the long run.
Your own country finances its social safety net through a value-added tax, and the countries that implement it have robust programs for the poor. When you say unshackled from financing constraints, you're basically saying to stop treating money as an account of real purchasing power. MMT just isn't the way to go. MMT relies on the assumption that there's a lot of unrealized productive potential or slack in the economy, and that the government can procure these untapped resources with new money to increase productivity in the long run. It assumes that when we reach the limits of productivity, we'll see inflation and we'll just magically slow down spending and increase taxes to stop it. But these are bad assumptions. There isn't really any evidence of massive amounts of untapped productive potential. The United States had full employment just last year, and wages were beginning to increase. Before COVID, of course, we were probably closer to full capacity than MMT economists think. So government would be competing with the private sector for real resources, not tapping into unrealized potential. Also, governments can usually only make more productive investments than the private sector in the long run. Things like investments in infrastructure, early childhood education, and nutrition can increase productivity decades after spending, but not in the short run. So it's unlikely that trillions in new spending would result in no inflation. Inflation will happen. The reason there is little inflation now, even though we're pumping trillions into the economy, is because output is down, and so pumping money into the economy only acts to offset a general price decrease. But if the economy was booming and output was up, pumping trillions into the economy would increase prices, resulting in inflation. But the worst assumption is political. Do you really think that once inflation starts, politicians are going to quickly vote to increase taxes or cut programs? That's a level of political discipline that our leaders simply don't have. Additionally, if we listen to MMT economists and have central banks operate at 0% interest rates forever, we won't be able to raise interest rates when we need to, which is a crucial tool of monetary policy to fight stagflation. MMT removes monetary tools to solve problems their policy would create, and relies on fiscal tools that have failed us over and over again. In short, I think the theory has elements that are definitionally true, but prescriptions that are misleading and simply wrong. MMT is just another iteration of the same siren song, with different proponents and the same ending. A debasing of the nation's monetary system. Yes, we've learned that deficit spending and loose monetary policy can be critical tools in the short run. But if governments abuse their power, yes, even sovereign currency issuers, they may lose the trust needed to make the fiat currency system work in the first place. What happens when such emergency policy becomes standard practice? What happens when the sovereign dollar, the backbone of the international economy, becomes unconstrained and decoupled from real resources? When the price system stops functioning as it should? When individuals and firms can no longer depend on prices as a signal to coordinate their decisions? Faith in government is at an all-time low, and we do need massive social spending to combat the crises of our century. But if we want to restore that trust, we need to fight these battles with honest revenue-raising mechanisms, citizens fulfilling statutory tax obligations, and some reasonable government borrowing, not governments abusing increasingly servile central banks. The question isn't how much abuse we can get away with in the short run, but whether the international monetary system can survive such radical prescriptions in the long run.
Well, as John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this kind of video, comment below and let me know. If you want to know about the future of the EU after the pandemic, check out this video. And don't forget to check out Arjit's blog, link in the description. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe. 'Cause this was my take.